So in this series which we are doing on the world history, earlier we talked about the various ideas and concepts which were associated with this particular period, issues in world history, and today we will talk about the economic recovery and the instability in Europe up to 1929. That is the period which is after the First World War. As we are very well aware that how the kind of devastation which was caused by the First World War, not only in terms of the loss of men, but we also find that how a lot of material, a lot of destruction was caused to the material property. So in that sense, we find that the various countries of Europe, how they were trying to recover during this particular time, because all of them had spent a lot of money in terms of war, and they had also borrowed heavily from other countries as well. So we find that because of which there was a lot of instability in Europe till 1929, and 1929 is also a period when we see the world economic crash or the economic depression. So before that, the kind of efforts which were being made by some of the countries of Europe to in a way recover from the kind of losses which they incurred during the First World War, and how because of this we find that many of the countries, their economy got destabilized. And we find that if we see the background, that how before the First World War many of the economies, especially Britain, they were doing very well, and but at the same time we find that Britain, which had been a dominant economy in the earlier period, was in a way now there is some kind of a decline could be seen. It was not the primary industrial power now. Other countries, especially Germany, they were producing more. USA was also emerging as a dominant economy. And with this we find that if we see the economy, then a number of problems they could be seen, where we find that some kind of a growth was falling. In that sense, rate of exports, they were also falling, and Britain in that sense was unable to catch up with other industrial economies in the field of technological change as well. But we find that situation in that sense was, at least to the most contemporaries, was quite satisfactory when we see the British economy. And we find that if Britain was losing in the commodity exports, as could be seen during this particular period, was being made up by the export of services during this time. And we find that while she was suffering from the technological lag, her network of trade and finance, it was prospering at this point of time. And if we see the economic situation of Britain at this point of time, then how the financial capital of the world was there, and we also see the kind of wealth which was coming to Britain. It was able to in a way develop Britain in that sense. And one of the contemporary observer, he remarked that the best country to be rich and leisured in was Britain in that sense. And it was also due to the fact, rather it was because of the fact that the colonies which Britain had acquired over a period of time, these colonies were giving a lot of support to Britain. And the kind of money which was coming from the colonies which were there in Asia and Africa was enormous, because of which we find that the position of Britain as a trading and financial center of the world had some kind of a preeminence. And when you talk about the kind of situation which emerged during the First World War and thereafter, we find that there is a lot of change in this particular situation. And we find that the kind of economy which Britain had, it contracted over a period of time, it did not grow. And we find that after the war, Britain emerged as some kind of a weaker economy when we compare it to the other economies of the world, especially Europe. And Britain was not able to kind of recover from the kind of a situation of the war. And we see that when you talk about the emergence of the new economies, in that case USA, the international leadership, the kind of a mantle it fell on USA on the international stage, and USA emerged as a dominant economy during this time. And in the First World War, we find that USA had not directly participated, because of which we find that a lot of support it was being given by it to the other economies of the world, and they became debtors to the USA. And we find when we try to assess the situation, we find that the evaporation of the old ways of doing business did not produce an equal change in old ways of thinking, and much of what happened in Britain and in other industrial countries during this particular period can be put down with the hindsight to the staggering intellectual myopia on the part of the policy makers. So we find that the kind of changes which came in the recent times, especially after the First World War, and we also see that when we talk about the Great Depression of the 1920s and the early 30s, where we find that many of the countries they lost the grip over the economies. And when we talk about Britain especially, we find that the Churchill's decision to return to the gold standard in 1925 was one of the reasons which was being cited as an important concern, which led to the decline in the economy, and it was seen to be some sort of a costly mistake. And one of the most important economists during this particular period, Keynes, and he was most incisive and often only the opponent of the ruling ideas, and he publicly wondered that why Churchill did such a silly thing when he returned to the gold standard. And when we see that when you talk about the economists of these particular period, and then they had their own ideas with regard to the economy, their understanding of the economy, and the politicians on the other hand, they had their own ideas. And when an economist of stature of Keynes, when he talked about that returning to the gold standard was a silly thing, then I think the politicians, they did not pay heed to these kinds of ideas, and he was in a way not heard by the politicians of that particular period. And perhaps it was being argued that he made the mistake of being right when men of greater reputation they were being wrong. And we see that in any case the policymakers in other countries, they also went on to do equally silly things as well. And when we talk about these politicians, how they gave a poor account of themselves in this period, at least till middle 1930s, and a number of recovery programs which were being launched during this particular period, they also tried to rescue many countries from the depth of depression. So we find that a number of countries they came up with some kind of plans for the recovery of their economies, and these plans they helped them in terms of the recovery, so that the kind of damage which was being done by the economic depression, it could be reversed. And we also find that the actions of those empowered to influence the national economies, they were some sort of a striking example of Liebning's law, that if a man of adequately complex mind acts with enough perversity, they will succeed in picking themselves out of the door into the street. So these kinds of examples, they were also being cited in that sense, that when people, those who have these kinds of ideas and how they are not able to in a way put the right ideas, or rather their own ideas which are seen to be perverse, and how these people they bring about the kind of change which was not required in those economies. And we find that Britain was one, then there were other countries as well, those who were suffering at the hands of some of the politicians of those times, those who were not able to understand the economic aspects. And we realized that some of the countries which came out of this situation, they also came out because of the kind of support which was being given through the various kinds of plans in terms of recovery which were initiated during this particular period of time. And we realized that such kind of plans, they provided a lot of monetary support so that these economies, they are able to come out, and the kind of problems with which these economies, they were afflicted, unemployment being one, and then we also find that there was a lot of depreciation or devaluation of the currencies in all these countries. We also find that some kind of bread riots, etc., they also occurred after the Great Depression. But when we talk about these kinds of aspects before the Great Depression, when we see that economies, how they were contracting in terms of their growth, that we have to understand. And we find that how British or Britain, they went out to streets in this particular period, and they were not able to manage to get back to the comfortable surroundings of the Victorian classical economy which was there earlier. And we find that the shock of the First World War was enough in that sense that they were not able to handle their economies. And we also find that when you talk about the First World War and the kind of changes it brought about, how the immediate post-war boom which Britain enjoyed especially ended in a slump in the mid-20s, and how Britain gradually lost its status as the leading industrial nation of the world. So these kinds of ideas, where we find that the kind of situation of boom, it turned into some sort of a gloom in the framework of the slump which came in the mid-20s. And we find that the gold standard with its fixed exchange rate system did not prove to be a viable mechanism to save Britain from the impending Great Depression. So we find that when we talk about the economy of Britain, the kind of issues or the complexities which were there in the economy, we find that these kinds of problems, they started in the 1870s, and how the industrial production from the 1870s to 1913 increased at only 2% annually. And when you compare it with the growth rate of the countries like USA and Germany, so it was quite less in that sense, it was far behind than them. And this kind of a relative decline can be principally attributed to the relative fall in the exports of goods, which were the engine of growth in the early period of industrialization. And we find that during this particular period, exports, they grew less fast because other countries had meanwhile industrialized. So we find with the industrialization in the other economies of the world, we find that they were able to produce the goods in their own countries, because of which we find that the exports which were going out of Britain, they in a way slowed down. They were comparatively less now, and Britain, which was the workshop of the world earlier, it was not now seen to be the workshop of the world, and it was not able to in a way hold on to the share of the world exports which it was doing earlier. So in that sense, we find that the preeminent position which Britain had, it was lost during this time. And we also see that this kind of an impact which was there, this kind of a loss in the leadership had however less impact than one would have expected at that point of time. So when we see the British economy of that particular period, that how it was dependent on the colonies as well, because a lot of money was channeled through the colonies in Britain. And also the national movements in various parts of the world to liberate themselves from the colonial rule, especially in India. We find that the role of the revolutionaries, the role of the Mahatma Gandhi during the movement, the role of INA, Indian National Army, the role of Subhash Chandra Bose and other political leaders. So all this created a kind of a climate where we find that especially in 20s, we see the role of the revolutionaries before that as well. The Ghadar movement, for example, some kind of international pressure which was being exerted from other countries as well, especially after the First World War. So this kind of a situation was not conducive to the British interests, and we find that when you talk about the colonial or the British economy especially, we find that the how the cushion which was being provided by the large exports of invisibles, which was the shipping, insurance and other commercial services, enabled the imports to rise. And we find that there was a need for developing production for the home market was correspondingly reduced as well. So when you talk about the British situation, we realize that the kind of changes which were coming in the British economy, especially after mid 1920s, and we find that if there were less exports from Britain, and how the other economies of the world, they were also developing at that point of time, because of which we find that there were less exports from Britain. It also in a way affected them in some sense, though it was compensated by the services which were being provided by Britain. But when you talk about the war, then how the problems of the British economy, they complicated after the First World War. And we also talked about the boom as well, that how boom was a short lived kind of a situation, where the accumulation of the pent up purchasing power during the war and the reduction in the level of stocks, they created conditions for a boom. And we also see that how men, they were demobilized and factories were deluged with the orders, and there was a sharp rise in the economic activity, especially immediately after the war. But we find that this kind of a boom later transformed into slump as well, especially in the mid 1920s, and thereafter we find that this kind of a change came in the British economy. And this kind of a situation further was complicated when we find that in 1929 the world economic crash brought this kind of a problem to not only America, but this kind of a problem was reflected in the European economies and the other economies of the world. And we also see, when you talk about, especially after the First World War, where we find that the governments, they were maintaining the high levels of expenditure, and how the production, employment and the prices, they were rising. And by 1921, especially in Britain, we find that the boom had worked itself out. And we also see that it was also importing from other countries, and how the domestic production, it caught up with the pent up demand. Credit restrictions which were there earlier, they were now imposed, and the boom turned into slump. So we find that this kind of a change in the situation in the framework of the economic downturn, and we find that on the other hand, when you compare it with the other economies of the world, then we find that they were still enjoying some kind of a boom. So which was in a way could be seen that it was detrimental to the interests of the British economy of that particular period, that how British economy had come into slump. And we find that such kind of a continued situation was further complicated when we had the world economic crisis in 1929. So we also have to understand this kind of economic situation of Great Britain, for that matter, in the kind of background which is available to us, and how this kind of a situation was developing in Britain over a period of time. And we also see that when you compare it with other economies of the world, especially USA, France, Japan, etc., then how construction activity was a dominant factor there. And we find that when you compare it with Britain, then how it was suffering from a housing shortage at that point of time, and yet there was no housing boom in Britain at that point of time. So we find that the kind of complexities which were there in the situation, and the remedial measures which could have been come. They did not come in that sense when you see the situation of Britain, and which got very well reflected in the kind of problems which it had to encounter during this time. And when we try to see the kind of restrictions which were being imposed, whether the high building cost, rent restrictions, and the way policies they were not being implemented by the authorities, they were being criticized for that. And so we find that there was no construction boom in Britain. And apart from this, we also see that other important reasons behind the British slump were its changed international position and the stringent credit conditions as well. So we find that the British situation at that point of time was such, and the kind of restrictions which it had imposed, apart from the kind of loss of the preeminent position during this time, were some of the factors which led to slump during this time. And when you talk about the economies of the world, especially after the First World War, how the contours of the international economy during this time, they had changed during this particular period. And we also find that the power equations, when you see from this point of view, either in the economic or the political sense, all of them they changed, especially after the war. And we find when you compare it with the economies of the world, how Britain and especially Germany also, we find they were comparatively weaker economies. And when you compare it with the other economies like USA, which was a dominant economy now, and when you try to see the other sectors of the economy, the most important sector during that particular period was agriculture. And agriculture was a prosperous kind of a situation in Britain, and how it turned into poverty was another important factor during this time. And when you talk about the network of trade, it also got altered, it also got changed, and we find that the kind of obstacles to trade, both in terms of tariff and currency fluctuations, they were also recognized during this time. So we find that there was a lot of change in the economic situation of Britain, and the various sectors of the economy, they were also in a way experiencing this kind of a change. And how agriculture, which was some sort of it was in a situation of prosperity, how it was reduced to poverty was an important concern. And we also see that how trade, which is also one of the defining factors of the economy, it also had some kind of a change during this time. So we in a way realize that how the changes in the economy were an important concern during this particular period. And we will further talk about the kind of changes which came in 1920s till the economic depression which happened in 1929 in our next lecture. Thank you very much.